Hello, one and all. That's a particular user, but hello to the rest of you as well. Thanks for the thoughtful reply um, on the divisibility of the self. I see you are not saying that the self is atomic per se, but you deny its composition. Not entirely clear to me if it's just the composition into anger or just in general into subpersonalities. Now, I will say that decomposing it into anger to me is somewhat simplistic. I think actually the decomposition is very individual. Every one of us has our own different subspirits, and they're not purely angry or purely anything. They are combinations as well. Certain relationships related to moods or states of mind that you in particular are prone to. That'll be both have genetic origins and conditioning, all kinds of origins. Um, I agree that the self is composed of these smaller exchanges and relationships with you. So we agree on this kind of thing. I was talking about a material demonstration of self in the fact that you can decompose the self, just materially by taking two halves of the brain. We know people who have a brain have a sense of self. So people can lose their brains. If there was a way to unwire and rewire the brain so they could survive, each half rather, they'd each have a sense of self. That's just a material argument. It's not an argument, of course, that anger deserves to be considered a sub-self, and I think we have to be more careful when we start talking about what those sub-selves are. But I do believe that we each have these sub-personalities that we can identify, moods and mindsets that we experience while we're thinking that are different from other mindsets that we can experience at other times while we were thinking. So you talked about the half self being lesser. Well, I mean, in what sense is it lesser? I mean, I actually would call it lesser, I guess, if you had to go from experiencing one to the other, but I don't think it works like that, right? We experience these lesser selves, and they combine together to make that full self. But how would you call it lesser? Because of the lesser processing power? I mean, to me, it's not, it doesn't make that much sense to call it a lesser self. It still has the quality of self, the full quality of having a self. What is lesser is the tools that self would have to work with. But because I am a materialist, I could call that a lesser sense of self in some sense, given the hypothetical of somebody that could experience one self and compare it with the other. I mean, okay, you'd have lesser cognitive power, so your sense of self would be lesser in that sense. But if the self is nothing, as you say later on, what does the half-self have to be lesser in comparison to? Is it less than nothing? So I'd like to hear that sorted out. Now, the part selves are different from the whole and lesser by definition, but not in their sense of having self. They're lesser in that they're partial with respect to a whole. But is that sense of self necessarily lesser? I mean, not usually, because we're talking about if there's a self or not. But if you want to talk about the full capabilities of that self, then the capabilities of the parts are lesser than the whole. Now, you also bring up the question and assert an answer to the question of, is the angry self that I have different or the same from your angry self? If I get angry at one person, you get angry at a totally different person. Are those not both anger? Are they really different? Well, yeah, I believe they're different. I believe that in your analogy of the car and the paint, the anger is more like the paint. The car is different. I mean, the similarity between the shades of paint make us think they might be the same. What's been painted red is it's a red thing, and so they're the same. They're red things. But really, they are distinct. The anger, we use this as a word as if it has its own meaning, but according to the way I look at these things, all that the word anger can mean is behavior. And so we'll have two different sets of behavior. Your so-called angry behavior and my so-called angry behavior. And that's forgetting all the permutations of behavior you have that you claim is an angry behavior, that I say is angry behavior, and things like this. So all we really have in anger is categories of behavior, and we see similarities in the behavior of different objects, and we ascribe the same word to them. But they really are distinct. They're two different systems, and it's like if what if we have two red vehicles? Are the vehicles not different? If we had two cars of the same make, Would you say they're really the same car? Even though I can dent one and the other one is not dented, that seems to show that they're distinct cars. Their similarity in design does not make them the same actual car. Okay, we say that kind of thing. I have the same car as you, but we don't literally mean that. We're talking about I have the same kind of car as you, and that is a very important qualifier when we're going to get really careful about what we're saying. Now, I suppose there are similarities between your anger and my anger. We do have we share designs through our shared DNA. But really, I can't assume those similarities, and so I'm not going to. Those similarities have to be demonstrated through behavior, and that process of demonstration never, ever, ever will end up saying that they're the same car. Anger in me and anger in you is never going to be the same material thing. We're going to say they have the similar characteristics, and which is funny because we're ignoring details so that we can say two things were the same. Your angry behavior, my angry behavior. The actions were different. Okay, even the specific kinds of expressions, those abstractions, those would be different, and yet we're going to say essentially they're the same because we have a word that ignores all the differences. It does not make those two distinct full sets of details the same. And that's the thing when we say is it things fundamental, inherent. Well, I would say what's inherent in a thing are the full set of facts or potential facts about it. Okay, not any of the abstractions that we make describing it. And those full set of facts, of course, are always particular and unique. The modes of transportation example that you use, those are two also materially distinct. We call them transportation because of a similarity we see. It's something helping us move our own location. But from that word, that minor and partial similarity between things that we can see are distinct, we should not say those are the same thing. Okay, they're different things. What they have in common is that they have this one detail of helping us move our own location or being able to, and that detail is just one little similarity. We can't say that the full set of details, these things, sense of self, which includes the full set of details, we can't say those are the same just because we found one little aspect of the same, and we're going to say, well, essentially, they really... No, see, that's what Plato did. It's like, well, I have a category for things. Therefore, the essential characteristic of those things is the belongingness that they have to that category, and the category is the real thing. And that's just bullshit, basically. And I knocked that on the floor. Okay, so these are not single unionized entities, all these modes of transportation. There are multiple entities. They're categorized by partial similarity, things they, just parts of themselves that they have in common, parts of their behavior specifically that they have in common. And there's one word, but not by any means one thing. It's multiple things. We have one word specifically so that we can deal with a world with multiple things and still reason with it. We create the one word so that we can ignore the details, because if we looked at every single detail, even that we knew, let alone all the details we'd have to discover, if we looked at every relevant detail in every calculation, then we would get bogged down in our thinking. And so we have tools for ignoring the details that are not relevant to the particular thought that we're having. If we're wondering, what paint should I use to paint an object out there, I don't care about the object's chemical composition. I don't necessarily even care if it's living or dead or any of these things. I'll simply care about its color. That won't make the same thing as the other objects in the same frame with the same color, even though I use the same paint to paint them. They're still distinct and they share some aspects so that I can therefore share some thinking of the two objects. And yes, this is the end of your videos where you got to the idea that self is nothing, which I think you contradicted some of your earlier claims that that these selves, half selves of a half brain, would be lesser in that sense. I think you have to sort that out. And of course, we agree that everything is made up of the interaction and interplay, and I think I'm taking that into account. In fact, that's what leads me into this way of thinking.